So I went over there to Germany after Thanksgiving 2001, and I spoke on the first week with 3 intelligence experts in Germany, 3 former heads of intelligence. And one man I spoke to, he told me that the 9/11 incident looked like a Hollywood production, pure Hollywood. Another one, this Mr. Vertebach here, told me that the deathly precision and magnitude of planning would have needed years of planning. He said that there's no way that it would have required the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization, something not found in a loose group of terrorists like the ones led by Mohammed Atta. I was getting a lot straighter information from these German experts than you got in this country. And I met this man also. He was a former German parliamentarian. His name is Andreas von Bülow. He's written some very good books about it, but his books are only in German. And here I am talking with him. This is 10 years after we first met. We met in November 2001. We sat around his kitchen table, and he told me there are 3 basic levels of a false flag terror attack of this sophistication. He said that the architectural level, the people who plan the attack, do so with the intention and with the purpose of affecting and changing public opinion. That's the whole purpose. And for example, in this case, I asked him, who do you think was behind it? And he said right off the top he thought it was the Mossad. And the purpose was to get an increase in defense spending in this country and to change our defense posture vis-a-vis the Middle East, to bring us into a war footing in the Middle East, which is exactly what we got. The second level is the managerial level. These are the people who manage the crime itself and who manage the third level, which is the working level. And in this case, for example, the 19 Arabs are the working level. And he said that level is actually part of the deception. It would be akin to like Lee Harvey Oswald. That's the deception level. That's the working level. So here we have 19 of these 19 alleged hijackers. And what's interesting to note about these men is that 15 of them lived in Florida, mostly in the Hollywood, southern Florida area. And these men, many of them, had been issued duplicate licenses in which they had gone and gotten their license one day, and the very next day somebody called up and said, hello, I'm Mohammed Atta, and I need a new license with my new address on it. The very next day. So then a duplicate license was issued for the same name, for the same person, with a different address. This is to be understood that there's a game going on here. What they're doing is that some intelligence agency is leaving a trail in that person's name. Other of these men had lost their passports previously. What you find with all of these characters is that there's a dual identity. There's an identity theft going on. And to understand how that works and how Mossad does this, I recommend reading this book, The Little Drummer Girl. It was written by John Le Carré back in 1982. He wrote it with the assistance of the head of Israeli military intelligence. And the book came out in the summer of 1982 as Israel was pounding Lebanon, if you remember. And in the book, and in the movie by George Roy Hill, Diane Keaton plays the role of this woman who's going along with the Mossad. And what she's doing is basically entrapping and leading a Palestinian man as they lead a false trail for him. It's a little complicated to understand, but what they're doing is the same thing they did in Florida. So that you have one of these hijackers, alleged hijackers, and what's been left behind in his name is a series of visits to strip clubs and bars and vodka bottles and strip dancers and things like this. So you wonder, well, why is this guy a devout Muslim? Why is he doing these things? You see? But somebody else has been leaving a trail in his name. And what one of the Mossadniks says in this book, he says, this is very important to keep in mind, terror is theater. Theater's a con trick. Do you know what that means? Con trick? You've been deceived. So really, whenever terrorism happens, whenever something act happens in San Bernardino or Paris or whatever, keep that in mind. Ask yourself, who benefits from this? Ask yourself, is the information that's coming from eyewitnesses, is this contradicted by what we're being told? And you'll find that 9 times out of 10, it is. Like in San Bernardino the other day, there was a shooting, right? And the eyewitnesses said, well, they saw the assailants. There were 3 tall, athletically built white men. They were like buffed. Yet the person who they shot was a small Pakistani girl, dark-skinned and short. Well, how did this tall, buffed white guy turn into a small Pakistani girl. Likewise in the Boston bombing. The FBI came up the next day or 2 days later and said that both devices, both bombs, were in black nylon backpacks. But we clearly see that Joker, the younger boy, who's still alive, was carrying a very white backpack. Well, why is he a suspect then? And furthermore, you know, the backpack that he was carrying, if it did contain, in fact, a bomb inside of a pot, it would have weighed a great deal. He just had it slung over his shoulder like it weighed maybe 2 or 3 pounds. It didn't weigh 50 pounds. So you see, there you can see that the evidence and the eyewitness accounts do not match what the government has told us. You're looking at false flag. You're looking at terrorism. You're looking at deception. And I can tell you, false flag terrorism, like what we're talking about with 9/11, is now the new norm. It happens on a daily basis in Iraq. It happens on a daily basis in Afghanistan. Both of these countries now have record terrorism attacks. Last year in Iraq, 20,000 people died from terrorism, and last year was also a record year for terrorism in Afghanistan. So if 9/11 is a deception, what does that make the war on terror? And where did the war on terror come from? Well, basically the war on terror is a Zionist Israeli fraud, which is based on lies and deception and exaggeration, as it has been since Benjamin Netanyahu began pushing it in the 1970s, most notably at the 1979 Jerusalem Conference, at the Netanyahu Institute, where George Bush spoke, where they began a big propaganda push with the media and the government that the United States and its allies should begin a war on terror, come into the Middle East, and start slaying those dragons and terrorist groups that were a plague for Israel. And this has been basically, the war on terror is a Zionist war agenda to be fought by us and our allies. Here we have Mr. Netanyahu in the back, that's with his father. And in 1976 to 78, he worked for the Boston Consulting Group in Boston, which is a Rothschild-owned firm. And in 1979, he went back to Israel and started with his father, the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And as I said, in 1979, they had the conference which called on the United States to come and wage a war on terrorism. This is also interesting. This is basically the time period when I lived in Israel. This is also the time when the Likud came into power, the Likud coalition. Here's Mr. Netanyahu, and he was asked by the New York Times on September 11th how the 9/11 would affect Israeli-American relations, and he said, "It's very good." He said, "Well, it's not very good, but it'll generate immediate sympathy." But I want to say, underline that reaction. That initial reaction was his gut reaction. It's good. It's good. Because what 9/11 did, it kick-started the war on terrorism that he had been pushing since 1979. A couple years later, he spoke to an audience in Israel, and speaking in Hebrew, he said this: "We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." Those are 3 things. But you see, in his mind, he conflates those 3 things into one thing. That's very telling. Now, it's interesting to note that Benjamin Netanyahu is the chairman of the Likud and has been the chairman of the Likud since 1993. On September 11th, before either tower had even fallen, this man was on TV in the London studios of the BBC World. The BBC World Television is the largest English-speaking broadcaster in the world. It reaches English-speaking countries across the world. And here he is in the studio, ready to talk with his rather thick kibbutznik accent. And he said that the world will not be the same from today on. He said, "We know who did this. It's basically Osama bin Laden. And we know where Osama bin Laden is." He said, "Now is the time for the United States to lead the world into a war on terror, into a concrete operational war against terror." So you see, here you have these biggest Israeli leaders telling us on day one that it's time to go to war. It's time to start the war on terror that they have been trying to start for already 21 years. So the war on terror comes from an Israeli construct that they had back in the 70s. They called it TNT, Terror Neged Terror, and that means terror against terror in Hebrew. Ehud Barak was the commander in the Sayeret Matkal of Benjamin Netanyahu. They belong to the same unit. The Sayeret Matkal is important to understand what that is. That is an independent, covert commando force that is responsible only to the Israeli Chief of Staff and military intelligence. And you will see that in the 9/11 saga, there were other Sayeret Matkal members. For example, Daniel Levin was on Flight 11. He's a Sayeret Matkal commander. Here we see the Chief of Staff. This is the Iranian man with the red beret on his shoulder. His name is Shaul Mofaz. He's Iranian-born Israeli. And here he is speaking at the Pentagon in January 2002. So what is that, 3 months later. And he's speaking with Paul Wolfowitz. Across the table from him is Dov Zakheim, the comptroller at the Pentagon. Sitting next to him is Douglas Feith. Douglas Feith, for example, his father was in the Irgun, or his father was in the Beitar, the Likudnik militia. Dov Zakheim was the comptroller of the Pentagon when it was announced on September 10th, 2001, that $2.3 trillion was unaccountable for in the defense budget. 2.3 trillion with a T. And you see, these men represent the neocon Zionist party in the White House, the war hawks. These men are not elected by anybody. These men are simply the advisors who advise the Pentagon what to do. These are the people in between. So what were they talking about at that Pentagon meeting? A couple years later, we found out what the plan was. And this is General Wesley Clark. And he told this on Amy Goodman's show in 2007. He said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. And one of the generals called me in and said, sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. He said, we're going to war with Iraq? Why? I don't know, he said. I came back a few weeks later, and by then we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? He said, oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Well, if you look at that list, the only ones that haven't been invaded in the last few years by the United States would be Iran and Lebanon. And we're pretty close to that. So you can see that this shopping list is very accurate. This is what the plan was. And as you can see, this is what they've accomplished. So that's why I call it the war on terror. When we say wars, we're not really talking about multiple wars with multiple causes. We're talking about one war effort with many aspects or many facets. Where does this come from? Well, this man was the founder of the State of Israel, so to speak. He's a Rothschild man. His name is David Ben-Gurion. And he told his general staff on May 24th, 1948, that's only 1 week or 10 days after Israel became a state. And he said, we should prepare to go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And he talks about how they'll put a Christian state in the south of Lebanon, break that up. And then he says, and then Syria will fall. We'll eliminate Jordan, and then Syria will fall. And if Egypt dares to fight, we will bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo. This is to give you an indication of how aggressive the Israeli Zionist agenda was from the beginning. These are the words of the founder of the State of Israel. What is he talking about? He's talking about something what they call in Hebrew, Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel means the land of Israel. And what they consider the land of Israel is whatever they think it is. But basically, the two blue stripes on the Israeli flag stand for the 2 rivers, the Nile and the Euphrates. And in between that Rothschild star, the 6-pointed star in the middle, is the Rothschild state in between those 2 rivers. So this map comes from an Israeli article. It's called What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like. And how do they accomplish this? The tactic that they use is something called Balkanization, basically Balkanization. It's the breaking up of a country into its ethnic constituent parts. Exactly what they did to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large secular socialist state, and after we broke it up with the NATO in 1995, it became 7 mini-statelets, all poor, all weak, all broken up. I don't know who thought that was any good idea, but it was George Soros was involved in the usual gang of criminals. But what they have done now in the Middle East is exactly the same thing. They've broken Iraq fundamentally into 3 pieces. Maybe you saw there was a giant bomb in Baghdad today. ISIS supposedly did it against the Shiites. So they bomb each other, basically false flag terrorism, to put these groups at odds with each other. You remember how in Yugoslavia there were massacres and things like that, so that one group would be at the other group's throats. Although these people had lived in harmony for thousands of years prior to. I have many Iraqi friends in Sweden, and they're very sad.